Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Refining Rhetoric. Today we learn about really increasing your child's attention span and the importance of having a worldview that is not disjointed as we raise our children. And we talk about all of that with Andrew Kern, the president and founder of the CiRCE Institute. So without further ado, let's jump in.
Classical Conversation Studios presents Refining Rhetoric with CEO Robert Bortons, a podcast where faith, business, politics, and classical education meet. Join us as we use the classical tools of rhetoric to seek truth in every arena of life.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Refining Rhetoric. Today, my guest is Andrew Kern. Andrew is the founder and president of the CiRCE Institute and a leading figure in the classical education movement, known for co-authoring Classical Education, the Movement Sweeping America, and another resource that we use on our own curriculum here at Classical Conversations, The Lost Tools of Writing. Over his career, he has trained teachers, started schools, advocated for classical education worldwide, and homeschooled his 5 children with his wife. Andrew, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Robert. It's an honor to be on Classical Conversations, anything connected to you. So thank you for that.
Well, we appreciate it. And of course, we're big fans of you. And I remember one of my first practicums that I attended, we were listening to just the idea of that children are souls to be nurtured and not products to be measured. And that has always stuck with me. And maybe we'll kind of dive into some of those ideas today. But I wanted to start off, first of all, with government education here in the United States. Was it doomed from the start? Or did it go wrong somewhere between Dewey and today?
Well, I think in this fallen world, everything is doomed from the start, right? We're born and then we die. And
Yeah.
It's just a question of what happens in between. I think I would say that in the case of American education, well, it depends what you mean even by government education, because if we go back to the 1600s, when the Puritan, the great deluder Satan law, there was the law that said every local community had to have a school in that local community. What is that now? State education? Is that government education? Or is it just the government saying you have to have an education and then giving it to the local community? And then does the local community, is that the state or is that the local community getting together? So part of what happens to me when I think about this is I get lost in the question of, well, what do you mean by government? But I will say this, that there was a time when Horace Mann in the 1840s and 50s led the state assembly in Massachusetts to start what became the first public school in America, public school system. And then there was, in the 1890s and 1900s, there was the rise of progressive education. And you mentioned Dewey. I think that Dewey's role was, he's a whipping boy, but at the same time, he was also a lightning rod. He was a person in whom a lot of ideas coalesced and by whom a lot of ideas were expressed. And so whereas almost anybody today would say, well, you're misrepresenting Dewey, the fact is he was still there. He was still the person through whom almost including he started the first teachers union. Right. So a lot of the things that happened since then are traceable to him or were enabled by him. So I would say that the Dewey moment was, I think from our perspective, we would have to say that was a negative, that was a very problematic moment. But I would even push it further, Robert. I'm gonna go off the chart. What do you call off the table? I forget the phrase now. Anyway, I'm going off it. Whatever it is, I'm going off it. I'm outside the box. I'm leaving the box behind. What box? I'm going to go all the way back to around 1500. And I'm going to say that things happened in the Western European mind, in the English-speaking, French-speaking, and German-speaking world, and Italian-speaking world, and Spanish. Anyway, Western Europe. Things happened to the Western mind. Decisions were made by leaders in society that had the seeds of what we're living out now. Sometimes they take hundreds of years to grow, but they grow.
Yeah, one of the things I've been saying lately is that the fruit of our society, of our civilization, is bearing out in front of us. And when people are saying, like, how did we get here? And they feel like it's happened overnight. It's been, whether it's been 20 or 30 years, or, 300 years,
Yeah.
the fact that our kind of Christian heritage has waned and has been given over to the pagans, that eventually you have to pay the piper for
Hmm.
really having a worldview that doesn't align with how the world works and how it was designed to work.
I was born in 1963. And so I went to school, of course, in the 60s and 70s, graduated high school in 81. And that was the era when Madeleine Marie O'Hara everybody knew her name. And that was because in the early 60s, she was the one who had constitutional amendments passed, or judges' decisions, rather, not amendments, judges' decisions to prevent prayer in school. And she was the one who led the march for secularization of American education. You talk to anybody who's slightly older than me, in other words, everybody that I grew up knowing about, and they would all tell you, all of them, we used to say the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of class. We had the Bible in our school. We had Bible stories as part of the curriculum. That was normal until the 60s. And then there was, again, at the leadership level, there were decisions, conscious and deliberate decisions made to formally exclude God from our schools. And that can't happen. I would contend that if you take away the principle of unity, you can't have unity. And when you start, whether that's in the student's mind or in the local community or in the nation, you can't have unity. And so what's happened is we've become fragmented in our own minds and in our communities and as a nation. And I think it's traceable, formally traceable in many ways, not completely, but in many ways, to those conscious decisions made in the early 60s.
Yeah, but we set up the environment before that to have adults
Absolutely.
that would make those decisions. So, but there is pivotal moments and pivotal
Correct.
people who get a outsized, credit, if you will, for the direction that we are in today. Now, you and I both believe classical education is a better model than modern education. I don't think either of us would argue that's the only thing you would need, but perhaps we would be in a more agreeable spot in a country if we were all classically educated. But what does that mean to you? Because even we might at CC really think about the tools of learning, but other people talk about, oh, it's the great books, and other people it's having a Socratic dialogue. So, how do you view classical education?
Well, I can give something like a formal definition that we use here at CiRCE, and then I can also list what I think are the essential elements. So let me do a definition first, so I can be all abstract and nobody can understand what I'm talking about, and then lay out the elements, make it even worse. But this is what we believe at CiRCE classical education is: it's the cultivation of wisdom and virtue, right? And in a word, that's what it is: the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. Now, the immediate question comes up, well, how do you do that? And we believe that you do that by nourishing the soul, right? First of all, you have, if you don't believe in the soul, you won't do classical education. And I would go so far as to argue that's probably why they don't practice it in America, is they don't believe in the traditional sense in the soul. And so you nourish the soul. And what does the soul feed on? Well, compare it to a plant. What does a plant feed on? It feeds on soil, light, water, and a few other things. I would suggest that the soil, light, and water of the soul are the true, the good, and the beautiful. And if you give the soul an endless, consistent stream of pure truth, pure goodness, and pure beauty, then you feed the soul, you nourish the soul well. And unless something gets in the way, including the child's will, then that child will become wise, more wise and virtuous than would otherwise have happened. But let's just say will become wise and virtuous. So that's in a very condensed, abstract way. That's what we believe it is. I would say there are four elements of classical education that we focus on. The first one is logocentrism, is the word we've settled on. The idea that there is a logos, And that's Christ the Word, Christ the Logos. And that means that God exists and speaks. But it also has a principle understanding. In other words, the Logos, I mentioned earlier that we've fallen apart because we don't have a principle of unity. Well, the
Right.
Logos is the first principle of all unity, right? He's the sun of the solar system, if you like. Without a sun, you literally don't have a solar system. I mean, solar system means system of the sun. You don't have planets, and if you took the sun out of the solar system, one of two things would happen. One is that every planet would just fly off into space. In other words, you'd have a dissolution. Everything would dissolve. You could say everything would fragment. The other possibility is that Jupiter is so big that Saturn might crash into Jupiter. Then that would become so big that is it Uranus or Neptune that's next. Anyway, the four gas planets would all converge on each other, and then the stone planets would, and then what you'd have is one big blob of death, right? You'd have no light, you'd have no life, you would just have death. And those are your two alternatives without a principle of unity, right? And so the idea of logocentrism is that there is a principle of unity. As Christians, we believe that's Christ. And that puts literally, Robert, and I mean, when I say literally, I mean like it used to be used, like literally, actually, right? Literally,
Yes.
Christ organizes, orders, unifies, harmonizes everything. Right? There's nothing that stands outside the life-giving, light-giving attraction of his glory. So logocentrism is the first element of classical education. The second is controversial word. I like using controversial words, but the second one is
Right.
humanism. And what we mean by humanism is not secular humanism, because that's anti-humanism, right? Christian humanism is the idea that you respect human nature. You respect what it means to be a human being. You respect you respect that God put into us as human beings certain faculties and abilities by which we can glorify him. And all we have to do, in one sense, all we have to do to glorify God is be a good human being. Right? Now,
Easier said than done.
oh, absolutely. It requires virtue, right? It requires discipline. It requires self governance. It's very hard to do, but it's also the only joy we have. I was thinking about this, how the modern world, everything it's doing seems to be to remove friction, right?
Mm.
The digital realm, the goal of every digital app is to remove friction. Okay. The trouble is, if you remove friction, there's nothing to grow on. You can't get strong. You can't walk. All you do is slide around the universe, right? It's friction that makes us become human, right? You can't, if gravity is a form of friction, it keeps us on the earth, right? We have bodies that if you're going to snap your fingers while you're doing music, you can't do it without friction, right? That's why reading a Kindle book, you forget almost everything. Whereas if
Hmm.
you read with an actual physical book and you write in the margins or on a notepad, you remember so much more because your body is engaged. And that's so crucial to being a human being. Part of humanism, as I'm using the term, is that you respect the human body. You respect the fact that the brain is not stuck in the skull, only functioning as an abstract processor. It's living in your fingertips. The brain is in your fingertips, right? It's a neurological system that flows through the entire body by God's design. So every God-given faculty we have is a means by which we can know him and we can glorify him. And therefore, let's take the ability to use language, since that separates us from the animals. If I learn how to use language better and I use it to curse God, I am trying to dishonor him. But in fact, I'm giving glory to him by the fact that I'm using language. Right? The very act of cursing God glorifies him, because the angels are looking on that, kind of probably laughing at the guy, right? The
Right.
guy's shaking his fist at God, saying, "God curse you," and the angels are laughing. Look how he's glorifying God down there. I mean, that's probably silly, but anyway, that's what I mean by humanism, is that God has given us, we're his image, and as his image, we need to be revered, we need to be respected, and we need to be cultivated. Okay, I better hurry up. The third principle is piety. And what I mean here is just a simple attitude of respect toward everything, right? Respect toward our ancestors, honor your father and your mother, respect toward our children, respect toward the world that we live in, respect toward the person that we're talking to. We have this disposition, not of cynicism, not of bitterness, not of everything's a threat to us, but this almost childlike, innocent attitude of reverence and respect toward everything we encounter. That tree out my window, I don't respect it as much as I respect the dog. And I don't respect my dog as much as I respect my mother. And I don't respect my mother as much as I respect my wife. But and I don't respect my wife as much as I respect God if my soul is rightly ordered. But in that order, everything gets the respect that it's due. And that's what we mean by piety. And then finally, coherence. And it kind of comes back to logocentrism. But the application is this. If I have one approach to teaching, and then a different approach to curriculum, and then yet another approach to assessment, and then another approach still to governance, then I'm confusing the child every time I do anything. And that creates incoherence, and it rejects logocentrism. It disrespects the child, so it rejects humanism. And it's not pious because it disrespects the God who spoke the world into being and as a harmonious, beautiful thing, and it disrespects the child. So coherence of the way we teach, with what we teach, with how we assess, and how we oversee and govern our schools and homes is essential to a Christian classical education. I know that's fairly abstract, but I have to put it in pretty general terms because the question was fairly high level. So forgive. I'll blame you. Can I do that? I'll just blame you.
Yeah, well, we talked to Scott Postma a little bit about Christian humanism. So if people can go back and listen to that episode if they want to dive into that more. And, if we're made in the image of God and, if we center our lives, I loved how you talk about just having the correct center. And that's how we need to start, because I look around us with the selfishness, the identity issues, the thing we see going on in society. And I go back to that child-centric education that everyone keeps talking about. And like even Christians, and homeschoolers often like, I want to be child-centric or my child's needs. And obviously you've got the factory setting that is public schools or government schools. But here at Classical Conversations, and even what you were saying is we put God at the center, that we put Christ at the center, that we are learning about him. And that unifying message, it's not about what you're going to get out of it, because that creates a selfish society, and a selfish society is going to break down and see all these problems with, woe is me, depression, suicide, identity issues. Those all come from that child-centric, what am I getting out of this, instead of how am I glorifying God with that attitude, in my opinion. But for our audience, of course, you have written a lot of materials. Of course, go visit your blog, go do a CiRCE training. But how have you found classical education? How do you sharpen yourself? What were those first kind of resources would you guide someone towards who wants to really learn more about this paideia?
Yeah. So I got involved in classical education formally 30 years ago. So to recall the specific books that were, really that drew me in at first would be difficult. But I will say that two books that I really liked, one was by Dr. Jean Edward Veith, and it was called Reading Between the Lines. And it's a Christian introduction to literature. And Dr. Veith understands literature, already then understood literature so well, so clearly, and is able to communicate with it's masterful. And so because literature is very important to culture, to society, to our souls, I strongly recommend that book. Another one that I read is one that probably you've read many times, and almost everybody in CC has probably at least heard of it and read parts of, and that's the Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, the one by Douglas Wilson, which really you could say launched the classical movement in a way. I think certainly energized it for a lot of people. And the essay in that by Dorothy Sayers was a big part of my getting involved at the beginning. Interestingly, I had encountered the trivium in college already. I had taken a medieval history course, and it was really interesting. But I remember one day My professor gave a lecture on medieval thought, right? On like 12th century medieval education or something like that. And in it, he mentioned this thing called the seven liberal arts, just to dismiss them. I
Mm.
remember very well. He said this: the trivium and the quadrivium, and this is what they thought was all knowledge in the Middle Ages. And I remember thinking, that's really interesting. So I did a little bit, of research because I didn't believe him when he said that there was nothing to it. He also was very dismissive of Anselm's argument and for the existence of God, and I could tell that he'd never really thought about it. So I decided, whatever he says, I'm gonna do what he tells me to do and challenge. I'm gonna think about it, right? So I got thinking about the seven arts, and so when I encountered the trivium, 2 or 3 years later, I'd say, no, 5 or 6. When I encountered the trivium as part of the seven liberal arts, I thought that was pretty amazing. And so right away, I started, I plunged myself into 2 questions. What is classical education? 3 questions, really. I helped start a school. And so I thought, what have I done? What is classical education? And the second question I was asking is, okay, how do you do it? And the third question is, why would you do it if you're a Christian? Right. So those 3 questions have really driven a lot of my thinking. And along that line, I will say this, that I now believe this, that my introduction to classical education was actually the Bible. And it was things like Daniel's prophecies and the kingdoms and things like that. I found those so fascinating. But the Gospel of John, right, and the book of Hebrews, very much foundational to all my thinking about classical education. Another thing I would add to that is C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. If you want your children to understand classical education, that's fine. I won't say don't. But what's much more important is that they experience it. And if you want them to experience a Christian classical education, probably the best starting point, well, let's say Aesop's fables and Bible stories. But after they get to 3rd or 4th grade, probably the best encounter with Christian classical education is in Narnia and in Middle Earth. So it's going to be Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. Then when they get older, they'll start reading essays by Tolkien and Lewis. But those essays will only explain what they've already basically experienced in story form, which is a much better way to do it. So I would strongly emphasize that. Another thing that I encountered early on, and I'm not sure why, well, I am because I'm super curious, but I encountered Plato's Republic and
Right.
Augustine's Confessions when I was in my late teens, and somebody told me to read them. And those are hard books. Man, they were very humbling. You don't just pick them up and go, oh, look, I'm going to Saturday evening read. And they were really challenging. And I can't say I finished either one at the time, but those introduced me to a depth of thinking, let's say, and a precision of thinking that I really had never encountered before. Although, wow, is it fun to watch Socrates just work through an issue. And it's very easy to draw principles and try to imitate him. So those are some of the things that got me started and got me really interested. Poetic Knowledge, then, by James Taylor, I think is a crucial concept. And I came across that book a little while later, late 90s, I think. And it's a hard go-to. So if anybody wants to read Poetic Knowledge, which I strongly recommend, it's not knowledge of poetry. It's a kind of knowing the world. Pages 30 to 34 really lay it out very concisely. And then the last 2 chapters, he gets into the narrative as opposed to technical philosophy. And so read the last 2 chapters first. That's what he told me, actually. Read the last 2 chapters first, and then read pages 30 to 34. And then go ahead and try to work your way through the hardship of the whole book. But that was a really helpful book for me. I won't go on and on because there over the years, I'm an old man now, so you collect a lot of books over the years. But those are some that I found really helpful.
Hey everyone, I want to take a quick break to tell you about a product that we love at our family, Scribblers at Home, recipes from lifelong learners. And it's full of step-by-step activities and things you can do with your family covering art, math, history, Latin, and much more. And it's really about intentional play. And whether you're in a classical conversations community or not, Scribblers will bring joy to every learner in the family, no matter what age. It would be a great Christmas gift for your own family or maybe a family that you love. So go visit classicalconversations.com/scribblers. That's classicalconversations.com/scribblers to get yours today, because the best gifts are experienced together. Now let's get back to the show. Now you've talked about how attention span has been decreasing in the United States, probably due to some of the technical decisions that we've made for our children. And you have a blog post called "Attention and the Enlargement of the Heart and Mind," and you talk about just fighting against distraction in children and how that's going to help them become more spiritually and intellectually developed. So, why is being able to multitask or having a short attention span, detrimental to a child's growth? And what's like one or two tips for maybe a parent listening that you would give them to really increase that attention span ability?
Well, let me address the why question first. Why does it matter so much? And the reason is because you become what you pay attention to, right? The medieval way of putting it was you become what you behold. The Bible says that too. It says that we become Christ-like. We are transformed from glory to glory by gazing on him, right? We gaze on him. We give him our attention. It's not by trying to be like him that we become like him. All that does is teach us how we can't, right? But by gazing on him, that's how we become like him. So giving him our attention, you could say. I would say. I would also say that whatever it is you give your attention to, your soul just forms itself to that, right? And so if you want to become a great basketball player, you don't go watch first graders play basketball, right? You might as a coach, but you certainly don't as a player, right? You go out and you find the best, right? If you want to write well, then watch the best writers write, right? Which is to say, read the best stuff. If you want to think better, then think with the best and imitate the best. And what it means to imitate is to pay attention first and foremost. Well, what you pay attention to, you will find yourself imitating, right? If you want to become, let's say you want to become a good writer, okay?
Right.
The very first easiest thing to do if you want to become a good writer is find a good writer, somebody who you like reading, and have and not just sentimentally, but you actually think, this person actually does things that are skillful. I can tell he's a good writer, okay? And just literally by hand write out what that person does for 5 minutes. Just write word for word what that person writes for 5 minutes. I strongly recommend Evelyn Waugh for this. Waugh. He's probably the best British stylist of the 20th century. George Orwell, another one. But just literally, just write, because when you're copying, right, you're paying attention, and that's how it is with anything. If you imitate something, you'll become like it, obviously. And the thing that imitation is doing is it's working together with paying attention. It's making you pay attention. Another way, and so you will become like what you pay attention to. And if what you pay attention to is something that's scattered and jumps all around and is emotionally driven and needs the constant dopamine hits, if that's what you're paying attention to, that's what you'll become like. And we've all seen, well, first of all, you mentioned earlier, we all know that the teenagers in our culture today are, when in the 80s, I was a youth pastor, okay? And at that time, the suicide rate had hit something of a peak. And I believe it was 1 out of 12 boys tried to commit suicide in the 80s. Okay.
Wow.
And then it dropped a little in the 90s and the noughts. I'm not exactly sure why. But then when the smartphones came in, the suicide attempts, especially among females, went through the roof. Right. And there's a strong, strong corollary there. But of course, you can't prove it with data yet because it's too complex a situation. So they will continue to do what everybody knows is killing people, they will continue. They will not apologize because everybody likes doing things that make them want to commit suicide. That's just the nature of being human. We like doing things that destroy us, right? It's always been that way. We like committing acts that give us sexually transmitted diseases, right? We like doing things that undercut our ability to pay attention. We like getting drunk. We like escaping from reality. But the more we escape from it, the more when we destroy reality with our behavior, we destroy ourselves from within. And that's just how it is. But we also like growing up, right? We like becoming who we're supposed to be, but we like it at a deeper level. And so we need to come up with ways to the parents of this. You asked if I had advice, and I would say there's three things you need to do: protect them from things that destroy their attentiveness; two, practice attentiveness; and three, maybe this is practicing attentiveness, but let me say it anyway: assess in ways that build it. Okay, and here's what I mean. Okay, so protect first. Things that undercut attention, you need to protect your children from. When I was a boy, that meant television. Everybody knew. In fact, when I was a senior in high school, the freshman group, at the same time that I was a senior, the freshman group, who were 3 years younger than me, were the first kids to watch Sesame Street for their entire preschool experience, right? So in other words, Sesame Street came out when they were about 2, okay? From the day they got into kindergarten until I met them in my senior year in high school and they were in my high school, they were told and then told me, the day we got to kindergarten, we were the least attentive class in the history of education. And it was because of Sesame Street, right? Because entertainment and rapid recollection of trivial bits of information and darting around were believed to be pleasant and fun, and therefore the spoonful of sugar that would make the medicine of learning go down. In other words, kids don't like learning, so you have to overstimulate them and make it fun for them, which is rubbish. Kids love learning. You don't have to give your kids a love of learning. You have to protect it. And how do you protect it? By not letting these forces come from the outside that undercut attention. And let me just emphasize that this didn't start happening 10 or 15 years ago. It just hit a kind of colossal booster rocket about 10 or 15 years ago with the smartphone. But if you love your children, keep them away from that smartphone until you don't want them to be a child anymore, right? People say, how long should I wait before they can have a smartphone? My glib answer is, when you don't want them to be a child anymore, then they can have a smartphone, right? Because they're going to lose their innocence that night. So that's one thing I would say is protect them. The second thing is practice. And let me just emphasize that you don't practice paying attention by being yelled at, okay? Now, it is true that attention is something of a matter of the will. So if they're frustrating you by not paying attention, sometimes it's okay to say, stop it, pay attention. But it's not as useful as you think it is. And you know that because it never was when you were a kid either. So how do you get somebody to pay attention? There's three things I think are crucial. One is questions. Okay, if a person is thinking about something, he's paying attention. And if you ask a question that they care about, then they're going to pay attention to the thing that you're now thinking about. And the second thing after questions is categories. Okay, and what I mean by that is, if the categories that you're using to think about a question are useful, they'll use them. So, for example, a category would be a comparison. That's a category. Or definition is a category. Or speed, right? Now, if what you're doing is cooking something that's got a marinade, and then you bring in the category of speed, it's not going to fit. It's going to create confusion. It's going to, you don't start discussing doing things super fast while it's marinating. It's confusing, right? So that sort of harmony of the way you're asking, the harmony of the categories you're using to think with the thing you're thinking about, okay? So marinating doesn't harmonize with speed. And the common categories or the common topics that classical rhetoric teaches are extremely useful categories. And the third thing is forms. And this comes back to attention and to just the pursuit of wisdom, because the forms that we use determine the direction of our thinking. Okay, so if the form of the game I'm playing is baseball, and it's got 7 or 9 innings, and it's got 4 balls and 3 strikes, and everything about it is the form of baseball, then I will do baseball things. I will learn what baseball can teach me. But if you start having 4 downs in the middle of a baseball game, again, I'm going to be confused, and I'm not going to know how to pay attention. I'm not going to be able to. And so we need forms that direct attention toward an end, because the forms determine the end. Examples of forms would be the structure of an essay, or even a syllogism, right? Those are forms that once you've practiced them a bit, then you know how they work, and your mind will just naturally flow into them and direct towards something. But if you don't know the forms of reasoning, which we do by nature in a sense, but at a certain point you start to get confused, you need to become conscious of them, right? If you don't know those forms, then you get confused, and when you're confused, you don't pay attention. So love of harmony is a kind of a sub-theme through all of this. Love of Christ, the harmonizer, right? You want that love of harmony that keeps the child motivated to keep paying attention. And then you want to provide forms that direct them toward useful outcomes or beautiful outcomes. And then you want categories that work instead of undercutting the thought that you're engaged in. And you want questions, and probably questions are of all those, the questions are the easiest to work with, because categories and forms is a little more abstract. But anybody can ask a question, right? If your child isn't paying attention, the one thing I would recommend that you do is ask him a specific question, right? By name, right? If you're not paying attention, I might say, Robert, what's that round object behind your head? Right. And then you're going to pay attention. You're going to look, right? You're tempted, aren't you?
Yeah, right. I'm like, what is it? Maybe a globe? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean the globe, right? And you see what I mean? You create a wonder. You create a gap in the mind, and our minds want to fill those gaps, right? And so use questions to arouse attention, and then use the form as kind of the map of where that attention is going to go now that it's aroused, and use categories along the way to teach them how to go on that journey. And every single small lesson, it works like that. Whether you mean it to or not, you have a form to your lesson, and you have questions that you're asking, maybe not on purpose, and you have categories that you're using, right? What you want to make sure of is that it's all harmonic, that it's all singing the same song, that you're not having to yell at them to pay attention, because they don't even know where the map is taking them. Right. And they don't know what are the tools, lost tools of learning, right? What are the tools by which I'm going to be able to go on this journey? And then what are the questions I'm trying to answer, which tells me what is the end of the journey. The journey's over when I've got my answer.
Well, our journey is almost over, and there's a question that I did want to ask you. Do we really need all this stuff? Because isn't ChatGPT and AI, can't we just rely on that now in the future? Do we even need to be able to check this stuff out or ask good questions? Don't we just need to be able to see what Microsoft and Apple's approved answers are?
Probably. You're probably right. Yeah, you're probably right. Because AI, as we all know, the more AI advances, the happier we are with our technological tools, and the less frustrated we become, because none of us cares if the tone of voice is humane, or if there's emotional intelligence involved, or if there's a human being at the other end. We don't care. So yeah, you're probably right. I think ChatGPT has brought an end to the classical movement. There's no longer a need for the classical movement, because artificial intelligence, by the way, since I'm getting ridiculous, let me just get serious for a moment. The words artificial intelligence, like the phrase artificial intelligence, like the phrase virtual reality, cannot possibly mean anything. Literally, they can't. Those phrases, I mean, you can force meaning into them, but that doesn't mean they mean what you're forcing into them. There cannot be any such thing as artificial intelligence, and there cannot be anything such thing as virtual reality. And this is what I mean by bad categories. Okay, those are categories that we have bought into. We have accepted that they have meaning. And all they have done is confused us. And their one goal is to disconnect us from reality by making it virtual, and from our intelligence by making it artificial. And if you want to know reality, you need intelligence. You cannot get to know the real world with artificial intelligence. And there is no virtual reality for artificial intelligence to get to know. Therefore, it may be artificial, but it's certainly not intelligent. And it may be virtual, but it's certainly not reality. And the farther we go down these paths, the more perilous our journey becomes. And the thing is, there are places, I think, there are places where artificial intelligence, as they call it, where massive algorithms have value, right? The data crunching, okay? And I would say probably the most significant place they actually have value is in medicine, finding cures, right?
Right.
They could have such value there, but we don't have the wisdom to keep it there. And until we get the wisdom and the virtue to keep the artificial tools, the tools that call themselves intelligence and call themselves reality, till we get the wisdom to know how to use those tools are not safe. And they will continue to fragment us and our souls, in our communities, and on the planet. We will not be able to be free people because we won't know how to deliberate. We won't know how to make our own decisions. If you can't make decisions, you can't rule yourself. If you can't rule yourself, somebody else has to rule you. And if somebody else has to rule you, you're not a free person, right? So that's what artificial intelligence and virtual reality are actually doing to us. They're enslaving us. They could, I think, ordered to Christ, be incredibly valuable tools. And in the kingdom of heaven, I suspect he's going to have a place for them. He's going to make them, he's going to fulfill their purpose. But don't ask me how.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. How can our listeners connect with you, connect with the CiRCE Institute? This conversation has been very interesting and has held my attention, so I know people want to hear more from you. How do people get a hold of you, Andrew?
Yeah, the easiest thing is to visit our website, CiRCEInstitute.org, CiRCE. It stands for Center for Independent Research on Classical Education. So CiRCE Institute.org. In addition to that, if you're interested either in our teacher training apprenticeship, in homeschool consulting by phone, in our Latin or Greek apprenticeships, or in our resources in our conferences, if you're interested in anything that we offer, the easiest thing to do is to write an email to info, I-N-F-O, info@CiRCEInstitute.org. .com works too, I think. And that will get to our info person who will distribute it to anything that you're interested in. But so for more information, go to the website, check out some of the things we do. For ideas, we have a blog, we have a podcast, things like that. And for in other words, to get general information. But if you have a little more specific question, write to info@CiRCEInstitute.org.
All right, Andrew, thank you so much. And yeah, go to CiRCEInstitute.org and definitely recommend everyone go check out their resources. Well, I really enjoyed talking to Andrew today. There's so much more that we could have unpacked, and we'll have to have him on again. But in the meantime, go check out the CiRCE Institute and keep sharing our podcast, the Refining Rhetoric podcast, because we are doing what he really encouraged us to do today, which is practicing those tools. And by having these conversations and by really unpacking what's going on around us, we can strengthen ourselves, which will help us strengthen our children. So until next time, share this with a friend. I would really appreciate it. And be sure to check us out on YouTube as we continue to expand the way that you can consume this podcast and practice those 15 tools of learning on a weekly basis. Until next time, God bless.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortons. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.